Colton Mercer slid the divorce papers across the marble table like he was closing a bad investment. Didn't even look at her when he did it. Just pushed them forward with two fingers, the way you'd push away a plate you were done with, and said, "Sign it, Alara. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." 31 people witnessed that moment. Partners, associates, the firm's most prized clients, women in designer gowns who watched Alara Voss with the particular cruelty of people who had already decided she didn't matter. Colton's new fiancée, Vanessa Hale, stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows with a champagne flute and a smile she wasn't even trying to hide. Alara picked up the pen. Her hand didn't shake. Not once. She signed. And she walked out of the most humiliating moment of her life without a single tear, without a backward glance, without one word that anyone in that room could use against her later. What happened next? None of them were ready for it. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who should have known better, this story is for you. Stay with us through every part. Hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it before this part ends, because what's coming will leave you speechless. Part 1. The morning of the divorce, Alara Voss woke before the alarm. She lay still for a moment in the guest bedroom. She'd been sleeping there for 6 weeks, ever since Colton had stopped pretending the distance between them was temporary, and she stared at the ceiling the way she'd been staring at a lot of ceilings lately, the kind of stillness that looks like peace from the outside and feels like held breath from the inside. She was 34 years old. She had a master's degree in international law she had never used. She could speak 5 languages, though she only ever let Colton hear 2 of them. She knew how to field strip a tactical rifle in under 40 seconds, but she hadn't touched one in 11 years, and she intended to keep it that way. She made coffee. She fed the cat, a gray, indifferent creature named Smoke, who had chosen her over Colton years ago with the same quiet decisiveness she wished she'd applied to her own life. She stood at the kitchen window and watched the Miami waterfront brighten from black to violet to the particular brutal orange that only happened in South Florida in October. And she thought about almost nothing. That was a skill, too. The emptying out. She'd learned it young, in circumstances she did not allow herself to revisit before noon. Colton came downstairs at 7:15 in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He poured coffee without speaking. He checked his phone. He was already somewhere else, already living the version of his life that didn't include her. And watching him move through the kitchen she had kept and the house she had made functional and occasionally beautiful, Alara felt something she couldn't quite name. Not grief, exactly. Not anger. Something older than both of those. "The car's coming at 9, he said, still not looking at her. "Randall moved the signing to 10, so there's time if traffic's bad." "I know," she said. "I have my copy." He glanced at her then, just for a second. Something crossed his face. She'd known this face for 7 years, had memorized the particular geography of it, the way you memorize things you love before you understand that love doesn't protect you. And then whatever it was closed back over and he looked at his phone again. "You should bring someone," he said, "for support. Your friend, whatever her name is." "Margot." "Right, Margot." He said the name like he was recalling a distant country. "You two are still close?" "We talk." She didn't tell him that she hadn't called Margot in 3 months. Hadn't called anyone, really. Alara had always been careful about how much she let people in, and the careful part of her, the part that had kept her alive and anonymous for over a decade, had been pulling the drawbridge up slowly, steadily, for longer than she wanted to admit. She went upstairs and dressed in the charcoal gray dress she'd bought for exactly this occasion, which she knew was strange, buying an outfit for your own divorce. But Alara had learned a long time ago that the right clothes were armor and armor mattered. Low heels, simple earrings, hair pinned back, not severe, not soft, just controlled. She looked at herself in the mirror and thought, "This is the last morning I will spend in this house." She felt, to her own faint surprise, something that was almost relief. The offices of Mercer, Patel and Hale occupied the 31st floor of a glass tower on Brickell Avenue, and the conference room where the signing was scheduled had a view of Biscayne Bay that people photographed for their Instagram accounts. Alara had been in this room before. She'd attended firm dinners here, watched Colton accept awards and shake hands and become, over the years, a man who was very good at performing competence and much less certain about the actual substance underneath. She had loved him, though. That was important to say clearly, even to herself, even now. She had genuinely loved him. Not perfectly, not without reservation, not the way they wrote about in the kind of novels she sometimes read on the balcony late at night. But real. It had been real. The room was fuller than she'd expected. Colton's partners were there. 3 of them, Randall Patel and 2 associates she recognized but had never spoken to much. Men who wore their ambition the way other men wore cologne. Noticeable, slightly aggressive, present in every room they entered. Several clients she knew by face. A woman from the financial press who Alara clocked immediately as someone who had been invited, not stumbled in. And Vanessa. Vanessa Hale stood near the window in a white dress, actually white, which Alara noted with a detached kind of dark amusement, with her dark hair loose over her shoulders and her expression arranged in something that was architecturally close to compassion but structurally made of triumph. She was 31, a former corporate strategist who'd pivoted to wealth management, and she was very beautiful in the aggressive way that certain women are beautiful, the kind where you're aware of the effort involved, and that awareness is part of the point. Alara had met Vanessa 4 times. Each time, Vanessa had been unfailingly polite in a way that made Alara's skin tighten. She sat down at the table. The papers were already there. Colton sat across from her. He had his professional face on, the courtroom face, the face that had won him verdicts and partnerships and a reputation for being unreadable under pressure. And for a moment, Alara looked at him and tried to find the man she'd married in there somewhere. She found traces. Not enough. Randall cleared his throat. We appreciate you both being willing to do this efficiently. The terms have already been agreed. I know the terms, Alara said quietly. We can skip the summary. Randall blinked. He was not accustomed to being interrupted by quiet women. Colton's jaw tightened slightly. The papers went around. Alara read every line, not because she expected surprises at this point, but because she always read every line, always had. It was one of the habits that had kept her functional in a life that required her to be, above all else, careful. The settlement was generous in the way that Colton did most things, with the specific generosity that is also a form of dismissal that says, I can afford to be fair to you, and I want you to know that I can afford it. She signed where she was supposed to sign. She initialed where she was supposed to initial. She put the pen down and looked up, and Colton was watching her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before. Something raw in it. Something he was working hard to keep from being legible. That's it then, he said. That's it, she agreed. She stood. She picked up her small bag. She nodded once to Randall, who looked vaguely uncomfortable, and she walked to the door without looking at Vanessa, because Vanessa didn't deserve the eye contact. She was in the elevator when her phone vibrated. A message from a number she had not seen in over 4 years, a number she had convinced herself she would never see again. 2 words. We know. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Alara stood there for 3 seconds, possibly 4, doing the kind of internal recalculation that most people never have to do because most people have never needed to construct an entirely parallel life and live inside it like it was real. Then she walked out into the Miami heat. She had been standing on the sidewalk for maybe 6 minutes, long enough to feel the sun on the back of her neck and decide she would get a cab rather than wait for the firm's car service, when she heard it. The sound reached her before the sight did. A deep, rhythmic percussion, rotors, multiple sets of them, coming from the direction of the bay. People on the sidewalk were stopping, pulling out phones. A woman in a business suit pointed toward the water and said something to her colleague that Alara didn't catch. Alara turned slowly. The helicopter, no, 3 helicopters, military dark, heavy-framed, moving in formation, were crossing over the bay at a height that suggested both capability and deliberate visibility. They weren't hiding. Whatever this was, it was not meant to be subtle. She saw the yacht before she fully understood what she was looking at. 300 feet, at minimum. Hull black as fresh tar. Moving through the harbor with the particular unhurried certainty of something that has never once needed to worry about who gets out of its way. There were smaller vessels flanking it, Coast Guard equivalent, private maritime security. She clocked the configurations automatically the way she clocked most things. And as it began to slow, Angling toward one of the private docking areas south of the main marina, she could see figures on the outer deck. Dozens of them, dressed uniformly, moving with a coordination that was not the coordination of ordinary crew. Her mouth went dry. She knew one yacht in the world with that hull profile. She had not seen it in 11 years. From behind her came the sound of the lobby doors opening again, voices spilling out. The signing party apparently concluding, Colton's voice among them, and Randall's, and the tinkling edge of Vanessa's carefully modulated laugh. The gathered press photographer who'd been covering Colton's firm was already swinging her camera toward the water. Several associates had come out to look. Elara stood perfectly still. She thought, of course it's today. Of all the days in 11 years, of course it's today. The yacht docked with mechanical precision, and the security detail that disembarked first was not the kind of security that worked for corporations or celebrities. These were operators. Former military, some of them, Elara knew the posture, the way they scanned, the way they moved through space like they were always accounting for angles. They formed a corridor along the dock. Two of them came forward to the dock entrance. She heard Colton behind her say, "What the hell is—" and then go quiet. The man who walked off the yacht last was not the largest man there, not the most visibly armed, not the most dangerous looking in any conventional way. I was perhaps 45, dark-haired, a silver streak above one ear that he'd had since his mid-20s. He wore a dark suit, no tie, the collar open. He moved through the security corridor with the loose, unrushed energy of a man who had never once needed to hurry because things arranged themselves around him rather than the reverse. She had not seen his face in 4 years. She had spent a significant amount of energy trying not to think about it. Dante Valerius walked straight to her. He covered the distance from the dock entrance to the sidewalk in about 12 seconds. His security held their perimeter. The helicopters had taken up positions overhead, hovering, not landing. The press photographer was clearly in crisis about where to point her camera. He stopped 2 feet from Elara. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone they have been genuinely frightened of losing. And this was the thing that 40 cameras captured, the thing that would be on every gossip site, and 3 legitimate news outlets by nightfall. Dante Valerius, the man whose name made international crime task forces rearrange their org charts, whose reach touched 6 continents, whose enemies tended to vanish with an efficiency that suggested thorough planning. That man dropped to one knee on a Miami sidewalk. "Princess," he said, and his voice was lower than she remembered, rougher. "It's time to come home." Elara looked at him for a long moment. She was aware of Colton behind her, aware of the silence that had replaced his voice, aware of Vanessa's particular frozen quality of silence that was different from everyone else's. She looked at Dante's face, the lines of it, the old scar along his jaw that she knew the story of, the dark eyes that had watched over her through the worst years of her life. And she felt something she had spent 11 years attempting to suppress rise up through her chest, like something breaking the surface of water. She said, "You're early." "The situation changed," he said simply. "I'll explain on the boat." "You always say that." And I always explain, eventually." She exhaled. Behind her, she heard Colton say her name. Just her name, Elara. In a voice she had not heard him use in years. A voice that held something fractured in it. Something that sounded like a man beginning to understand that he has made a catastrophic miscalculation. But she was already moving, already walking toward the dock, and Dante had risen and fallen into step beside her, and his security had adjusted their perimeter to include her without anyone giving an audible order. At the edge of the dock, she paused. She looked back. Colton stood on the sidewalk in his excellent suit with the divorce papers presumably still upstairs in his conference room, and he was watching her with the expression of a man standing in the wreckage of a story he thought he'd understood, realizing he had not understood a single word of it. Elara held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to feel nothing in particular, and then she stepped onto the dock. The boat was enormous and cold and full of people who had known her before she had become the person she'd spent the last decade being. The main salon was set up as a tactical briefing room. Screens, maps, communication equipment, and several of Dante's senior people were already positioned around it with the contained tension of professionals who had been managing a problem for some time. Dante closed the salon door. He looked at her the way he always looked at her when they were alone. Different than outside, no performance to it, just the older brother exhaustion and the older brother relief that she had learned to read before she could read much else. How long? She asked. We identified movement against you 3 weeks ago. He moved to one of the screens. Whoever leaked your location, and someone did, Ilara, someone gave them enough to find you. They'd been building a file. Financial, personal, social. A pause. The divorce wasn't coincidence. What do you mean? I mean, someone helped it along. He looked at her. Your husband's new partner, Vanessa Hale. She has connections I don't think he knows about. Connections that run back further than their relationship. Ilara sat down in one of the chairs. It was a strange sensation, the familiar weight of her old world settling back onto her shoulders, the particular gravity of it, heavier than ordinary things, heavier than the small, careful life she had built. Who? She asked. Dante's expression shifted. Not quite fear. He didn't really do fear, not outwardly, but something adjacent to it, something careful. That, he said, is the part I need to show you. He turned to the screens. And Ilara Voss, who had spent 11 years being a quiet wife in a city that had never once suspected what she was, leaned forward and looked at the face of the enemy she had apparently never fully left behind. Her hands were still. Her face was still. Inside, something that had been asleep for a very long time opened its eyes. The face on the screen was not a stranger's. That was the first thing. The thing that hit Ilara before any of the information attached to it had time to arrange itself into meaning. She knew that face. Not well, not the way you know someone you've spent real time with, but in the way you know someone who has always existed at the edge of your peripheral vision, present in rooms without being central to them, mentioned in conversations without being the subject of them. Lucien Arcos, Dante's consigliere, his strategist, the man who had served the Valerius organization for over 2 decades with a consistency that everyone around him had interpreted as loyalty, and which Ilara, looking at his photograph now on a tactical screen aboard her brother's yacht, was beginning to understand had been something else entirely. How long have you suspected him? She asked. Dante's answer took 3 seconds longer than it should have. 6 months. She looked at him. 6 months. I needed to be certain. And are you? Another pause. 90%. Ilara stood up from the chair. She moved to the screen and looked at Lucian's file. The financial trails, the communication intercepts, the series of decisions over a span of 20 years that looked, individually, like competent management of an organization's survival, and looked, collectively, like something else. Something with a specific direction, a specific goal. The massacre, she said. Not a question. The evidence isn't complete, but what we have... Dante stopped. He pressed his hand flat against the table, a gesture she recognized from their childhood, the one that meant he was controlling something he didn't want her to see him feel. What we have suggests the external attack was coordinated from inside. Someone gave the opposition the access codes for the compound's perimeter system. Someone made sure the family's security rotation left a window. Ilara was quiet for a long time. She had been 13 years old the night of the massacre. She remembered it in the specific, fragmented way that the brain processes things it cannot fully absorb. Not as a continuous narrative, but as a series of sensory images, isolated and vivid. The sound of the initial breach, the weight of the hand that had grabbed her arm in the dark and pulled her toward the secondary passage. Dante's voice, low and absolutely controlled, saying, "Don't stop, don't look back, keep moving." The smell of smoke from a direction that had not been on fire a minute earlier. She had never questioned how the opposition had known the layout well enough to move through it the way they had. She had been 13. 13-year-olds in crisis don't ask structural questions. They just run. Who else knows? She asked. On our side, 3 people in this room. You, me, Marcus. He nodded toward the door, beyond which his head of operations, Marcus Vale, was presumably managing whatever required managing. And I want to keep it that way until we know what Lucian knows about what we know. You think he's aware he's under surveillance? I think he's been ahead of us for 20 years, Dante said. I'm not going to assume he's stopped. Ilara turned away from the screen. She walked to the narrow porthole window and looked out at the Miami skyline. All that glittering certainty, all those towers full of people living inside ordinary problems. And she thought about 11 years. 11 years of careful, deliberate smallness. A name that wasn't hers. a life that fit like a coat that was almost the right size, always slightly wrong across the shoulders. She had chosen it. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. She had chosen it because the alternative was this exact weight, this room, this particular quality of danger that didn't announce itself with dramatic music, but sat in your chest like a stone you'd stopped noticing because you'd been carrying it so long. You said someone gave them my location, she said without turning from the window. Someone leaked that I was here. Yes. And Vanessa Hale has connections that run back further than Colton thinks. Yes. She turned. Show me. Dante pulled up a second file. Vanessa Hale's financial history was layered in the specific way that intentional obscurity gets layered, the kind that looks like complexity from a distance and looks like architecture from close up. Ilara followed the threads with the quick, practiced focus of someone who had spent years pretending she couldn't do this kind of analysis and had never entirely succeeded in forgetting how. 3 shell companies, 2 of them inactive, 1 operational, registered through a Cayman intermediary that connected, at 3 removes, to a holding structure that the Valerius organization's intelligence people had flagged 18 months ago as affiliated with a competing syndicate. An old one that had reason, historical, personal, financial reason, to want Ilara Voss identified and accessible. She targeted Colton deliberately, Ilara said. We believe so. His firm had just taken on a significant estate case, an international inheritance dispute involving assets that were originally Valerius adjacent. Vanessa's principals wanted access to the documentation. Colton was the path in. A beat. You were the complication. So she manufactured a reason to remove me. Forged evidence of financial misconduct on your part. Planted it where Colton would find it. Made sure he found it at a moment when the marriage was already stressed enough that he'd reach for the narrative she was offering him. Dante's voice was level, but she could hear the thing underneath it. The barely contained fury of a man who has been watching someone he loves get maneuvered and who didn't catch it in time. He wasn't an accomplice, Ilara. He was a tool. She sat with that for a moment, Colton's face in the conference room, the 2-finger shove of the papers across the table, the way he'd said, don't make this harder than it needs to be, the specific phrasing of a man who had been handed a story and swallowed it whole because it was easier than the alternative, because the alternative required him to look more carefully at a woman he had long ago categorized as uncomplicated. She found she couldn't be angry at him in any clean, useful way. What she felt instead was something more complicated and more corrosive, the understanding that she had contributed to her own invisibility. She had needed to be unseen, and so she had been, and the cost of that was that the man closest to her had looked at her every day and had not known her at all. That was on both of them. She was honest enough to hold her half of it. There's a third element, Dante said. His tone shifted, just slightly. The way a person's tone shifts when they're about to say something they've rehearsed and still don't feel prepared for. She looked at him. He pulled up a third file. This one was thinner, less documentary evidence, more inference, more analysis, the kind of intelligence work that represents the shape of something rather than its proof. We've been tracking communication between Lucien and an outside party for approximately 4 months, Dante said. Encrypted, layered. Our people had to work to get even the fragments we have. But the timing of those communications correlates with 3 things. The initial movement against your location, the intensification of Vanessa's operation against your marriage, and a series of internal decisions Lucien made about the organization's security posture that, in retrospect, he stopped. In retrospect, left certain access points more open than they should have been. He's coordinating with them, Ilara said, the same people who came for the family 20 years ago. The organization has changed since then, rebranded, new leadership on the surface, but the same principles underneath, same inherited grievances. He looked at her directly. They want the Valerius holdings, the legitimate assets as much as the others. Your grandfather built structures that have been quietly generating value for 40 years, and whoever holds the dynasty holds access to those structures. Lucien has apparently decided that the safest path to that access is to deliver you. The air in the salon felt different after he said that. Deliver me, she repeated, alive. They want documentation, authorizations, access credentials, certain legal instruments that only the direct heir can execute. Once they have those, I know what happens once they have those. She stood up again, She couldn't seem to stay still. Dante, how exposed are we right now? The yacht's security is clean. I've had Marcus run 3 sweeps in the past 48 hours. He hesitated. But Lucian knows I came for you. He knows you're on the boat. He doesn't know what we know about him yet, or at least I don't believe he does. But the window on that uncertainty is not large. Where is he now? Gibraltar, managing the European side of the operation. A pause. He's scheduled to join us in 4 days for the Vienna summit. The Vienna summit. Alara recognized that phrase. A semi-annual gathering of the organization's senior people, operational, financial, legal, that had been a fixture of the Valerius calendar for 30 years. Legitimate on its surface. A significant amount of real business conducted at it. Also historically the moment when the organization made its most consequential internal decisions. 4 days. She pressed 2 fingers against her temple. An old habit. It didn't help, had never helped, but her hands needed something to do. The door opened. Marcus Vale came in without knocking, which meant it was something that didn't wait for knocking. He was a compact, gray-haired man of 60 who moved like someone 20 years younger and whose face was permanently arranged in an expression of focused dissatisfaction with the current state of affairs. "We've got a problem," he said. Dante looked at him. "Define a problem." "Colton Mercer is requesting to come aboard." The silence in the salon was immediate and complete. Alara turned to look at Marcus. "What?" "He's at the dock entrance, came on foot, left whatever escort he had at the street." Marcus's expression didn't shift. "He says he has information relevant to your safety. He says—" A brief pause that suggested Marcus found the following statement somewhat beneath him to relay, that he's not leaving until he speaks with you. Dante made a sound in the back of his throat. "Turn him around." "Dante." Alara's voice was quiet. "He's a liability, whatever he thinks he has. If he came here like this, alone, on foot, without calling anyone, then something happened in the last 2 hours that scared him enough to override his ego." She looked at her brother. "His ego is considerable. Whatever scared him past it, I want to know what it was." Dante held her gaze for a long moment. She watched him calculate, weigh the security risk against her judgment, assess whether this was sentimentality or strategy. And she let him do it, because they both knew that when she said something in this particular tone, she had already concluded that she was right and was being patient while he caught up. He exhaled. "Bring him to the secondary meeting room. 2 guards inside. I'm in the room." He looked at her. "Non-negotiable." She didn't argue. They moved Colton through the access corridor quickly, which she thought was probably a disorienting experience for a man who spent his professional life controlling the pace of rooms. He arrived in the secondary meeting room looking exactly like a person who had spent 2 hours discovering that the floor he'd been standing on was not, in fact, floor. He was still in his suit. He'd taken off the jacket somewhere. She could see him carrying it, sleeve-gripped, the fabric slightly wrinkled in a way that his suits were never wrinkled. His hair was not quite right. His eyes had the particular quality of recent shock. Wide open, processing speed visibly elevated, the expression of a man whose internal model of reality has just been invalidated by actual reality. He saw Dante first. The two of them sized each other up in the way that men who occupy very different categories of power sometimes do. Colton assessing threat, Dante assessing intent, both of them arriving at conclusions within seconds. Then Colton looked at Alara. "You're not surprised," he said, "that I came here." "I'm reserving judgment," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She remained standing. Dante stood against the wall, which was not coincidental. Standing against a wall in a confined space has a specific psychological effect on the person sitting down, and she knew Dante knew that. "Tell me what happened," she said. Colton put his jacket on the table. He put both hands flat on the surface. She recognized this as his preparation gesture, the thing he did before a deposition when he was organizing a complex narrative. She said nothing. "Vanessa left," he said. I don't mean she left the building. I mean she left. Her assistant called me 20 minutes after you walked out. Said Vanessa had cleared her office, canceled 3 weeks of appointments, and taken a car to the airport." He paused. "I went to her apartment. Her things are gone. Not all of them. Like she packed for a long trip, not like she moved. but the specific thing she would have taken if she was running. Another pause. I know what running looks like. I've done enough divorce work. Alara said nothing. I started going through her files, the ones she kept on our shared server for the merger work we've been doing. He looked up. Alara, there are documents in there that I don't fully understand them, but they reference your name. Your name before we were married. He said it carefully, like someone who has recently learned that the ground in front of him may or may not support his weight. Your name that you don't use. The name you told me was just an administrative artifact from a former visa. Beside the wall, Dante made no movement. And they reference transactions, Colton continued. Fund transfers. From holding companies I've never seen before, moving through 3 different instruments, all of them converging on a legal structure that was supposedly dissolved 15 years ago, but I had one of our forensic accountants look at the top layer, just the top layer. He called me back in 40 minutes and told me he couldn't keep working on it. Why? Because he recognized one of the names on the subsidiary board. Colton looked at her with something unguarded in his face. Not just fear, something rawer than fear. The expression of a man confronting the distance between who he thought he was and what he actually knows. He said he needed to not know this. Those were his words. I need to not know this. He's been doing forensic accounting for 22 years. Alara sat down across from him. She looked at him, really looked at him, the way she had stopped letting herself look at him somewhere around year 4 of their marriage, when she'd understood that the looking was too costly, and she made a decision. Not about him, about what needed to happen next. Colton, do you have copies of what you found? Encrypted drive, in my jacket. He nodded toward the folded suit on the table. I made copies before I came here. I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew I wasn't coming without documentation. Despite everything, she almost smiled at that. He was still a lawyer. He would probably be a lawyer about his own death. She reached across and took the jacket. She found the drive in the inside pocket, small, black, unremarkable, and she set it on the table. Dante pushed off from the wall. He came forward and picked up the drive without asking anyone's permission. I'll have Marcus verify this before it goes anywhere near our systems. He looked at Colton with an expression that was not hostile but was not warming toward warm. You said Vanessa went to the airport. Do you know where? No, I called. She didn't pick up. Her assistant said she left with a carry-on and 2 hard-sided cases and didn't tell anyone her destination. Dante looked at Alara. She looked back at him. The same thought she knew, moving through both of them simultaneously. If Vanessa was running, she was running toward something, not just away. Running to report. Running to deliver. Running because the operation had been exposed faster than expected, or because something had shifted in the timeline, or because someone had told her to move. Lucien. I need to make a call, Dante said. He didn't move toward the door. He looked at Marcus, who had appeared in the doorway without Alara quite catching the moment of his arrival. Marcus disappeared again. The call would be made, results would be delivered. Colton was looking at Alara. Who is he? He asked. My brother, she said. The silence that followed was very dense. She watched him process it. The yacht, the security, the helicopters, the name that his forensic accountant had refused to look at twice. She watched him run the arithmetic of the last 7 years of his life through this new variable and watch the answers change shape entirely. Your brother, he repeated. My adopted brother. He's... She stopped. There was no version of this sentence that wasn't enormous. He runs an organization. International. It's complicated. I can see that it's complicated. Colton. She waited for him to look at her directly, not at the walls or the equipment or the door. I need you to understand something. Whatever you think you came here to do, warn me, fix something, make something right. It's already more involved than that. You have seen things in the last 3 hours that most people who see them don't walk away from easily. The only reason you're going to is because you're sitting across from me and because I am telling you that you will. He was very still. What happened to you, he said, before I met you? It was the question she had been half waiting for him to ask for 7 years. The real question, the one underneath all the smaller questions he'd never quite gotten to. About the dreams she sometimes had, about the fluency in languages she didn't explain, about the small calibrations she made in public spaces that she'd always hoped he'd attribute to ordinary anxiety. A lot, she said. She didn't say more. Not yet. Because Dante's communications operative appeared in the doorway at that moment with an expression that Ilara read immediately, a tightening around the eyes, a specific quality of controlled alarm. And she was already pushing back her chair before the woman opened her mouth. "We've got a signal hit," the operative said. "The drive he brought?" "I swept it," Colton said, standing sharply. "I swept it before I left the office. I'm not an idiot." "The sweep wouldn't catch this," Dante said, his voice completely flat. He was already moving toward the door. "It's not a tracker on the drive. It's a passive signal embedded in the document architecture. Whoever created those files built a location beacon into the metadata. When the drive connected to any network within range," he looked at Ilara. "They know exactly where this yacht is," she said. "They knew before," Dante said. "We knew they knew. But now they know that we know about the drive, which means—" "The timeline moved," she finished. "They're not waiting for Vienna." The three of them stood in the secondary meeting room of a 300-foot yacht in Miami Harbor, and the silence lasted approximately 4 seconds, which was how long it took Marcus to reappear in the doorway, this time with his earpiece in and his jacket open and the specific expression he wore when something had gone from a problem to an emergency while everyone was looking the other way. "Dante," Marcus said, "we have radar contact. 4 vessels, moving fast, no identification signals. 12 miles out and closing." Colton made a sound that was almost a word. Ilara picked up the encrypted drive from the table. She looked at it for 1 second. Then she looked at Colton. This man she had been married to for 7 years. This man who had never known her, who had been used as an instrument against her, who had walked onto a Mafia kingpin's yacht with an encrypted drive and the specific bravery of someone who doesn't fully understand the room they're in. And she made another decision. "Stay close to me," she said. "Don't ask questions for the next 20 minutes. Don't move unless I tell you to move." He nodded. His face was the color of old paper. She was already walking toward the door, and somewhere above them, the helicopters that had stayed aloft over Miami Harbor shifted their formation with the particular precision of people who had just received an order. And outside the yacht's walls, the evening light was falling across Biscayne Bay in long gold strips, beautiful and indifferent, and 4 vessels with no identification signals were cutting through open water at speed, with a destination that everyone aboard the black-hulled yacht now understood with absolute terrible clarity. There was no version of the next 24 hours that looked anything like the life Ilara had been living this morning. She had known, standing at the kitchen window with her coffee while Colton checked his phone and the cat wound around her ankles, that today would end something. She had not known it would end everything. The first explosion hit the water 40 yards off the starboard bow. Not a missile, a warning shot, or what passed for one among people who communicated primarily through escalating degrees of violence. The concussion moved through the hull of the yacht like something alive, a deep percussive shudder that Ilara felt in her back teeth and in the soles of her feet simultaneously, and around her the organized motion of Dante's security team shifted immediately from preparation to execution. Marcus was already on comms. "Defensive perimeter, outer ring engage. Do not fire on the vessels until I give the word." He looked at Dante. "They want us to run. If we run, they dictate the direction." "We're not running," Dante said. "I know we're not running. I'm telling you what they want so you know why they'll escalate when we don't give it to them." Ilara was at the tactical screen. The 4 vessels had separated. 2 holding position at 11 o'clock, and 2 o'clock, 2 more swinging wide to flank the yacht from the south. Fast boats. She could see the radar signatures, the kind of rigid hull inflatables that military and well-funded private operators used when they needed speed and low profile and didn't care particularly about comfort. "How many personnel per vessel?" she asked. "Estimate 6 to 8 each," the communications operative said without looking up from her screen. "Based on the displacement readings. 24 to 32 people. Against Dante's onboard security complement of 18, plus the helicopters, plus whatever maritime response was already being triggered by the explosion. Because they were in Miami Harbor, not international waters, and someone had just detonated something 40 yards from a 300-foot yacht in full view of a waterfront that was currently lined with evening pedestrians. And that was not the kind of event that the Coast Guard or the Port Authority or any of the 17 other overlapping jurisdictions in this particular stretch of Florida water were going to ignore. "They know we'll have law enforcement response inside 8 minutes, Ilara said. Which means whatever they're planning to do it in less than that." Dante looked at her. What do you think they're planning to do? They don't want the yacht. They want me off the yacht. She kept her eyes on the radar. They'll try to force a transfer, disable our propulsion, make us stationary, and extract under the chaos before the Coast Guard gets here. If they can't do that, they'll try to take out the helicopters and then come over the rail. A beat. You sound like you've done threat assessment before, Colton said from the corner of the room. His voice was controlled in the way that voices get controlled when the person using them is working very hard not to sound as frightened as they are. Nobody answered him. Get him below, Dante said to one of the guards, nodding toward Colton. No, Colton said. Dante looked at him with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being told no and has, over the course of many years, developed a response to it that does not involve repetition of the request. I'm not going below and being blind to whatever's happening up here, Colton said. He was shaking slightly. Not his hands, his shoulders, a fine tremor that he was visibly attempting to suppress. I brought that drive onto this boat. Whatever comes through that rail because of it, I'm not hiding from it. Dante looked at Alara. Let him stay, she said. Put him against the interior wall. If shooting starts, he goes flat. I can follow instructions, Colton said, and the particular crispness of this statement, delivered by a man who was clearly terrified and stubbornly refusing to be only terrified, caught in Alara's chest in a way she didn't have time to examine. She turned back to the screen. The second explosion was different. Not water, hull. It hit below the waterline on the port side, a shape charge designed to flood rather than destroy, and the yacht listed 2 degrees to the left before the automated damage control systems began compensating. 3 degrees of list would limit their maneuverability. 5 degrees would stop it entirely. They're going for immobilization, Marcus said. I know. Dante pulled one of the guards toward him and spoke fast and low. The guard moved. Dante. Alara said it quietly. She was looking at something on the screen that had not been there 30 seconds ago. A 5th radar contact, different profile from the attack vessels, moving not from the open water but from the dock side, from inside the harbor. There's a 5th boat. It wasn't with the formation. It's been sitting in the harbor this entire time. Marcus was already looking. It's not ours. No, she said. It's inside our defensive perimeter. Yes. The implications of that moved through the room like cold air. An asset pre-positioned inside the harbor, before the attack formation arrived, before the yacht had even fully docked, possibly before Alara had walked out of Colton's conference room. Something that had been waiting, something that had known exactly where the yacht would be. Not intelligence gathered in the last 2 hours, intelligence that predated today. Someone told them where to park, Marcus said. Someone told them everything, Alara said. The dock position, the defensive configuration, the helicopter coverage patterns. She paused. Someone who's been on this yacht before. The room went still in the way that rooms go still when a thought becomes a conclusion, and the conclusion is bad. Dante's face was doing something she had not seen it do in a long time. Something that was not anger and was not fear, but was the specific expression of a man who is being forced to confront a possibility. He has been refusing to fully inhabit. A clenching around the eyes. A stillness of the jaw that came from keeping it still deliberately. Marcus, he said. Already running it, Marcus said, his voice completely flat. He had his tablet out. I was moving through access logs, communication records, the yacht's internal security footage from the past 48 hours. Fast, very fast. The 3rd explosion hit the port side again, higher up this time, and several of the salon's windows cracked simultaneously. Alara felt it in her collarbone. Behind her, she heard Colton make a sound that was not quite a word. Dante's security teams were returning fire now. She could hear it, controlled bursts, the helicopters repositioning. And through the cracked windows, the Miami waterfront was awash of blue and red emergency lights, Coast Guard response already visible on the horizon, which meant they had perhaps 4 minutes before this became an international maritime incident with cameras and everything that came with cameras. Alara. Marcus's voice had changed. She turned. His face was gray. I need you and Dante to look at this. He put the tablet on the table. The footage was from the yacht's secondary communications room, time-stamped 14 hours earlier, before they had even arrived in Miami while the yacht was still in transit. The room was supposed to be empty during transit. Access logged, secured, 2-key entry. The figure in the footage was blurred, Matt. Deliberately, someone had placed a small adhesive diffuser over the nearest camera lens, the kind of thing you'd only know to do if you knew exactly where the cameras were. But the figure was not entirely unrecognizable. The height, the specific economy of movement, the way the person used the communications console, not hunting for functions, not learning the interface, but using it with the muscle memory of someone who had spent significant time at it. Opening a channel, transmitting a burst communication, closing it again. Elapsed time, 4 minutes, 11 seconds. 14 hours ago, while the yacht was at sea. "Can you clear the face?" Dante asked. His voice was very quiet. Marcus shook his head. "Not enough resolution on this angle, but..." He swiped. Another camera, different angle, caught the figure leaving the communications room and moving down the corridor toward the crew quarters. For 1.3 seconds, the corridor camera had an unobstructed angle. It wasn't enough to be certain. It was enough to be almost certain. And almost certain, with a context this specific, was functionally the same thing. Alara knew the person in the footage. She had met them precisely twice, once at a Vienna summit 7 years ago, which she had attended in her real identity for the last time, and once at a private organizational dinner 18 months after that, which was the occasion on which she had decided that she needed to disappear entirely and had begun constructing the architecture of her exit. Both times, the person had been introduced to her as a junior analyst attached to Lucian Arcos's strategic team. Both times, she had noted them and filed them and moved on. Both times, she realized now they had been watching her with the specific attention of someone taking inventory. "That's not Lucian's analyst," she said. Marcus looked at her. "No? That's Lucian's daughter." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Dante pressed both hands flat on the table. His knuckles were pale. He said nothing for 5 seconds, which was a very long time for Dante Valerius to say nothing. And in those 5 seconds, Alara watched him reprocess 20 years of association, 20 years of trust extended and relied upon and built into the operational skeleton of everything he'd constructed, 20 years of a man he'd considered a second father reconfiguring itself into something else entirely. "She's been on the boat before," Marcus said. He was still moving through records, fast, relentless. 3 times in the past 2 years, official capacity, coordinating with Lucian during summits, full access clearance. "Full access," Dante repeated. "Deck plans, security rotations, camera placements." Marcus put the tablet down. "She didn't need to scout anything today. She already knew everything." A fourth explosion, further away. One of the helicopters engaging the attack formation directly, the sound of it different from the hull charges, louder, sharper. Through the cracked windows, Alara could see tracer fire across the dark water. She was not thinking about the attack formation. She was thinking about the sequence. Lucian's daughter on the boat 14 hours ago, transmitting coordinates and configuration data to the incoming assault team. Lucian in Gibraltar, running the strategic layer. Vanessa Hale already in the air, her operational role completed, extracting before the violence she'd helped set in motion could reach her. And Lucian himself. Lucian, who had been scheduled for Vienna in 4 days, who Dante had been planning to surveil carefully and calmly over those 4 days while he built the remaining 10% of his certainty. She grabbed Marcus's arm. "Where is Lucian now? Current location right now." Marcus pulled his phone. It was already dialing. 2 seconds. 3. He looked up. "He's not in Gibraltar." Marcus. The bottom fell out of the room. "His last confirmed location was Gibraltar 18 hours ago," Marcus said, his voice doing the thing it did when he was compressing significant alarm into operational calm. "Since then? Nothing." He dropped off all monitored channels simultaneously. "He's not in Gibraltar," Alara said. She said it again, not because she needed to, but because saying it helped her think. "He left 18 hours ago. The communication from the yacht was 14 hours ago. The attack formation was pre-positioned in the harbor, which means planning that took at least 36 hours, Marcus finished. "He's not coming in 4 days," she said. "He's already here." Dante looked at her. "The Vienna summit was misdirection," she said. 4 days, coordinate positions, give us a timeline to plan around, while he was already moving, already in place. She looked at the radar. The 5th contact, the pre-positioned boat inside the harbor, had not moved during the attack. It was still sitting there, waiting. The attack formation isn't the operation. It's the noise. It's what we're supposed to be looking at. Then what's the operation? Colton said from the wall. He'd gone very still. She looked at the radar contact. She looked at Dante. She said, "Who's on the lower deck right now?" Marcus was already moving for the door. He didn't make it. The lights went out. Not a power failure. A cut, precise, targeted, the auxiliary systems going down alongside the primary in the specific sequence that required inside knowledge of the yacht's electrical architecture. Emergency lighting kicked in after 3 seconds, red-toned and thin, and in the sudden altered quality of the darkness, Elara heard two things simultaneously: a crash from the direction of the lower deck stairway and the sound of a door she did not recognize being opened. She moved. Not toward Dante, not toward the door, toward the tactical console, because the console had a backup battery system, and the backup battery system had a 30-second spin-up, and she needed to know where every person on this yacht was before anything else. Colton caught her arm in the dark. "Elara, let go!" She said it without breaking her motion. He let go. 25 seconds for the console to come up. She watched the screen populate. Heat signatures, internal sensors, the yacht's emergency tracking system mapping every moving body. Upper deck clear. Salon level, herself, Dante, Marcus at the door, Colton at the wall, 2 guards. Lower deck, 4 of Dante's people at their stations, and 1 person who should not have been there. In the secondary corridor off the engine room, a passage that existed in the yacht's original design but had been sealed during a refit 2 years ago. A passage that was not on any current deck plan. A heat signature moving with the unhurried confidence of someone who knows exactly where they're going. Dante. She turned. Secondary corridor, engine room level, the sealed passage. His expression shifted. That passage was not as sealed as you thought. She was already at the weapons cabinet. She had not touched a firearm in 11 years. Her hands remembered without being asked, and there was something disturbing about that. The ease of it. The muscle memory that did not care how many years of deliberate distance she'd put between herself and this moment. She checked the load, checked the safety, and turned. "Stay up here. Keep Colton with you." "You're not going down there alone," Dante said. "If you come with me, there's no one up here with authority to make decisions." She looked at him, held his gaze, the way she used to when they were younger, and she needed him to stop trying to protect her long enough to think clearly. "Give me 2 guards and stay on the console. If that signature moves toward the upper deck, you'll see it before I do." He didn't like it. He'd never liked it when she was right, and he didn't like the conclusion. "2 guards," he said. "Comms open the entire time." She moved. The lower deck was dark and close and smelled of machine oil and the particular recycled air staleness of spaces that don't get much human traffic. The 2 guards moved with her through the corridor. She didn't know their names. She knew their capability by the way they placed their feet, and that was enough. And she kept her breathing slow and her focus narrow. The sealed passage entrance was behind a maintenance panel. The panel was open. The seal had been cut, cleanly, with a tool designed for it, not forced. Someone had prepared this. Someone had been inside this yacht in the past 48 hours with time and equipment and the specific technical knowledge to cut a composite panel without triggering the vibration sensors. Lucien's daughter. 3 visits in 2 years. She moved into the passage. It was narrow, designed for cables and conduit routing, and the emergency lighting didn't reach it at all. She worked by the small tactical light on her guard's shoulder, moving in sequence, aware of every sound. The passage curved left and then descended. A short ladder, maybe 12 rungs. And at the bottom was a space she had not known existed. A compartment. Small, functional, deliberately unremarkable. A fold-down shelf. A communications unit, portable, military grade. A case open on the shelf with specific contents arranged in the specific way that people arrange things when they have been trained to work in confined spaces under time pressure. And in the corner, sitting on an equipment case with his hands on his knees and an expression of perfect, undisturbed calm, was Lucien Arcos. He was 63 years old, silver-haired, lean, with the kind of face that is easy to trust. Not handsome, not striking, but arranged in a way that reads as steady, as reliable, as the face of a man who has spent a long time being the person others brought their problems to. He looked at Alara the way a person looks at someone whose arrival they have been expecting. "I wondered if you'd find the passage," he said. His voice was exactly as she remembered it, unhurried, the consonants precise, a faint Mediterranean undertone. "I gave it maybe 60-40 odds that you would." Her guards moved to position on either side. Lucien did not look at them. He kept his eyes on her. "You've been here the whole time," she said. "Since this morning." He folded his hands together, a gesture of such complete ease that it was itself a kind of aggression. "While your brother's people were running sweeps of the yacht, they were sweeping the systems I'd already secured, looking for what I'd already removed from the visible architecture." A small movement at the corner of his mouth. "Dante's people are excellent. They are not excellent at finding things that weren't there to begin with." "The attack formation," she said. "It's a diversion." "It's a negotiating context," he corrected. "I find that people have more focused conversations when there's a degree of external pressure." "What do you want to negotiate?" He looked at her with something that was almost, not quite, but almost, resembling genuine interest. "I want you to understand something before we get to the negotiation," he said, "because I think you deserve to understand it. I think you've deserved it for 20 years, and you've simply been kept from it. Don't explain yourself to me like I'm going to sympathize with you. I'm not asking for sympathy." He uncrossed his hands. "I'm asking you to consider that the story you were told about the massacre is incomplete. That the people who told it to you, including your brother, had reasons for the version they chose to give you." She kept her gun level. "What version would you give me?" "The version where your grandfather was not the man Dante believes he was," Lucien said. "The version where the massacre was not an unprovoked external attack. The version where your grandfather made an agreement, a binding, documented agreement, with people he later decided were inconvenient to honor, and where the events of that night were, from a certain perspective, the consequence of that decision." Her hands were still. Her face was still. Inside, something moved. "That's a convenient story," she said. 20 years later with no one alive to contradict you." "Not no one." He reached into his jacket, slowly, watching her, the gesture of a man communicating that he's not reaching for a weapon, and produced a document case. Slim, leather, with a fastening that looked old. He set it on the shelf beside him. "Your grandmother survived that night, Alara. Not the grandmother you were told died in the East Wing. Her mother. Your great-grandmother's personal secretary, who has been in my care for 18 years because she asked me to keep her safe from the people who would have silenced her." The compartment felt smaller than it had when she walked in. "She documented everything," Lucien said. "Every meeting, every agreement, every decision your grandfather made in the 5 years before the massacre. And the organization that came for your family that night. They're not my allies. They never were. They were his creditors." Alara said nothing. "The people I have been working with," he continued, "are not the people you think they are. They are not remnants of an old enemy. They are—" He stopped. He looked at his hands for a moment, and for the first time she saw something in his face that was not performance, something tired underneath the calm. "They are the legal representatives of the original compact, the one your grandfather violated. And what they want is not you. It was never you." He looked up. "It's the documentation. Proof that the Valerius holdings were built on a violated agreement. Proof that entitles the other signatory parties to a 49% claim on everything your grandfather built and everything built since." She let this settle. She let it settle, and she looked at Lucien Arcos, at his 63-year-old face, his steady hands, his document case, his 20 years of proximity to her brother, and she thought about what it would mean if any part of this was true, and she thought about what it would mean if none of it was, and she thought about the one thing that had not changed regardless of which version was accurate. "You've been lying to Dante for 20 years, she said. He didn't flinch. "Yes. You built his trust and you used it, and you've been feeding his operation's vulnerabilities to people whose claim against him you decided was legitimate. That's one way to describe it." "Is there another way?" He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 20 years trying to find a resolution that didn't require anyone else to die," he said. "I failed at that. I'm aware I failed." Something shifted in his face. Not guilt. She wasn't sure Lucien Arcos experienced guilt in any way she would recognize. More like the specific exhaustion of a man who has been managing a very complicated problem for a very long time and has recently accepted that management is no longer possible. The attack formation outside is not under my control. I want to be clear about that. I arranged the context, but the level of force they chose, he shook his head. That's outside what I authorized. You don't authorize them, she said. You think you do. You've always thought you did. She moved toward him, one step, two, until she was close enough to see the individual lines in his face, and he was close enough to see that her hands had not moved an inch. Where is Vanessa Hale? A flicker, first real one. She executed her role and extracted. She's not relevant to, where is she, Lucien? He looked at her. He read something in her face that made him, for the first time since she had walked into this compartment, look slightly uncertain about the evening's trajectory. Above them, through the hull, she could hear the Coast Guard loudspeakers beginning their approach. Sirens. Commands in amplified English. The attack formation would be breaking off. You didn't sustain an engagement when the Coast Guard arrived with this kind of visibility, not without consequences that exceeded the operational value. The external pressure was lifting, which meant the negotiating context Lucien had constructed was evaporating, which meant the next 60 seconds were going to determine a great deal. Alara reached past him and picked up the document case from the shelf. Hey! One of the guards moved, but Lucien raised his hand and the guard stopped, confused, because Lucien had just gestured as though he had authority over Dante's security team, and the guard had instinctively responded to it, which told Alara something very specific about how deeply Lucien's influence was embedded in the operational culture of this organization. She stepped back with the document case. You're going to come upstairs with me, she said. You're going to sit across from my brother and you're going to tell him everything you just told me, every word of it, including the parts that will break something in him that probably won't fully recover. Lucien looked at her. And if what I've told you is true? If the documentation in that case supports what I've said? Then we deal with it, she said. The way we should have dealt with it 20 years ago, if anyone had been honest enough to try. She held the document case at her side. But that's a conversation for after. Right now, you need to understand something. She held his gaze. The woman you've been maneuvering against for the past 11 months, she said quietly. The woman you leaked to Vanessa's operation. The woman you pre-positioned your assets to extract from this yacht. She is not the person who walked into this compartment tonight. That woman doesn't exist anymore. Lucien Arcos looked at Alara Voss in the red-tinted emergency light of a hidden compartment in the hull of a black yacht in Miami Harbor, and for the first time in the conversation, he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just recalculated something important and does not entirely like where the calculation has landed. Take him up, she said to the guards. They moved. She followed, the document case in her left hand and the gun still in her right. And as she climbed back through the narrow passage toward the light, she understood with perfect, settling clarity that the person she had been this morning, careful, contained, deliberately small, sleeping in a guest bedroom in a house that had never quite been hers, that person had taken the last steps she would ever take. What came next would require someone else entirely, and that someone else had been waiting inside her for 11 years, patient and still, for exactly this moment to arrive. Dante's face when Lucien walked through the salon door was something Alara would not forget. Not rage. She'd expected rage, had braced herself for it, had been mentally preparing the words she would use to hold him back from doing something that would cost them the only leverage they currently had. But what crossed her brother's face was not rage. It was the particular devastation of recognition, the expression of a man who has been carrying a suspicion so heavy and so long that when the confirmation finally arrives, what he feels first is not anger, but exhaustion. A terrible, boneless exhaustion, as though the weight he's been holding has suddenly stopped being weight and become nothing, and the nothing is somehow worse. He looked at Lucien for 4 seconds, then he looked at Alara. She gave him the document case. He set it on the table without opening it and turned to Marcus. Get the Coast Guard liaison on the line. Tell them the attack was a private maritime security incident. Give them the cover documentation, and get them off our hull within the hour. He paused. Tell them we have a situation under control. Do we? Marcus said. Dante looked at Lucien. Sit down. Lucien sat. Colton was against the wall where she'd left him. He was watching all of this with the focused, careful attention of a man who has understood that he is inside something he does not have the vocabulary for and has decided that observation is his only useful contribution. His hands were steadier than she'd expected. She filed that away. What followed was 45 minutes of the most concentrated and brutal conversation Ilara had ever sat in, and she had, in a previous life, sat in some genuinely brutal conversations. Lucien talked. Dante asked questions in the voice he used when he was controlling himself absolutely. The voice that was so contained it barely sounded like voice at all. Marcus cross-referenced what Lucien said against the documents in the case in real time, pulling records, verifying signatures, flagging inconsistencies. There were fewer inconsistencies than Ilara would have preferred. The documentation was real. The agreement her grandfather had signed 46 years ago was real, a founding compact with 3 other syndicate families, a binding arrangement for shared governance of certain territorial and financial interests, a document with the specific legal architecture of its era, handwritten in 2 languages and notarized by a name that Marcus confirmed, after 8 minutes of research, had been a legitimate Maltese solicitor who had died in 1997. The violation was real. Her grandfather, in the late expansion years, had systematically excluded the compact's co-signatories from assets they were entitled to, had restructured holdings in ways that buried their claim, had, according to the secretary's testimony, documented in Lucien's case with a recorded deposition and signed witness statements, made the decision that the other families were no longer useful, and arranged for them to understand this through methods that were not legal and were not gentle. The massacre had been their response. Ilara sat with this. She sat with the specific internal sensation of a foundational story being dismantled. Not the story about herself, not the story about Dante, but the story about where they had come from and what had been done in the name of the dynasty she had spent 11 years running from and the last 12 hours being pulled back toward. She sat with it, and she breathed through it, and she did not let it move across her face. Dante was not as practiced at that. He stood up in the middle of Lucien's explanation of the compact's 3rd clause and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room for approximately 90 seconds. Nobody spoke. Marcus looked at his tablet. Colton studied the floor. When Dante turned around, his face was arranged again, but his eyes were red at the edges in a way that they had not been before, and Ilara understood that her brother had just, privately and silently and in 90 seconds, grieved something that was going to take him much longer than 90 seconds to fully grieve. "The people outside," Dante said to Lucien, "the ones who sent the attack formation, they're the legal representatives of the original compact families? The inheritors, yes, 3rd generation at this point. Their legal claim is documented. Their methods tonight," Lucien's voice tightened slightly, "their methods were not coordinated with me. I arranged for them to have a location and a timeline. The level of force they deployed was a decision made above my operational role." "Above your operational role," Dante repeated. "I am not their commander. I am their intermediary." "You've been their intermediary for 20 years while sitting in my organization." "Yes." Dante said nothing for a moment. "Where are they now?" "Withdrawing. The Coast Guard presence eliminated the tactical window." Lucien folded his hands. "But they'll reconvene. The claim doesn't disappear because tonight failed. And the person they've identified as the authorized heir," he looked at Ilara, "the only person with current legal standing to either contest or settle the compact's claim, is her." Everyone looked at Ilara. She had known this was coming for the last 40 minutes. She had been thinking through it while Lucien talked, while Dante processed, while Marcus verified, running the structure of it, the implications, the available moves. There were 3. She had been evaluating them since the moment she understood what Lucien's documents actually contained. "If I contest it," she said, "we're in litigation across 6 jurisdictions for a decade minimum. The organization's legitimate assets are frozen during that process. The criminal task forces that have been looking for an opening use the public proceedings as their entry point, and we spend 10 years losing things we built, while lawyers who charge by the hour argue about a compact that was signed before I was born." Lucien nodded slowly. "That's an accurate summary of option 1. If I settle it, acknowledge the claim, negotiate a percentage. We legitimize 46 years of grievance. We set a precedent that destabilizes every other arrangement the organization has. And whoever receives the settlement uses the capital to build a competing structure that spends the next decade trying to finish what they started tonight. Less accurate, but not entirely wrong, Lucian said. There are settlement structures that could... I'm not done. She looked at him. Option 3. He was quiet. The compact was signed by my grandfather, she said. The violation was committed by my grandfather. The documentation supports the claim against the estate of Emilio Valerius, not against the current organization. She kept her voice level. Emilio Valerius's personal estate was a separate legal structure from the operating syndicate. His assets were dispersed at his death under a private instrument that predated the compact. She looked at Marcus. Pull the 1987 estate instrument. Marcus was already moving. Lucian's expression had shifted. Something in it, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The expression of a man who has been playing a very long chess game and has just seen an opponent's hand move to a square he did not anticipate. You've looked at this before, he said. I looked at it 4 years ago, she said, when I first started understanding what I'd left behind. I spent 6 months mapping the organizational legal architecture. I wasn't going to come back into this without knowing where the floors were. 4 years ago, Dante said. He was looking at her, something in his voice. When you disappeared. When I went quiet, she corrected. There's a difference. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it. If the personal estate disbursement predates the compact's violation claims, Marcus said, looking up from his tablet, then the claim runs against a dissolved structure. Against a dissolved structure with no current assets, Alara said. The compact families have a legitimate grievance against something that no longer exists. Their documentation is real. Their claim is real. What it's against is a legal ghost. She looked at Lucian. Which you knew, or should have known if you'd looked as carefully as you thought you did. The silence in the room had a different quality than all the silences that had preceded it. Lucian looked at her for a long time. She let him look. It won't satisfy them, he said finally. The legal argument is sound. The people who sent the formation tonight are not primarily interested in legal arguments. No, she agreed, which is why the legal argument is the public move, and the other conversation happens privately. She stood. I need a secure line to Gibraltar. Not your contact there, ours. Someone the compact families have not had 20 years to compromise. She looked at Dante. And I need the Vienna summit moved. Dante's eyes narrowed. To when? To now. To this boat. Tonight. She looked around the room, at her brother, at Marcus, at Lucian sitting in his chair with the particular stillness of a man who has just realized the game has changed underneath him. Every principal who was supposed to be in Vienna in 4 days. I want them here in 12 hours. Because when the compact families regroup from tonight and decide what comes next, I want them walking into a room where we've already decided what comes next first. Dante looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at his tablet. I can get 8 of the 12 here by morning, Marcus said. The other 4 are in time zones that make... Get the 8, she said. The 4 can be on a secure video link. This is moving very fast, Colton said from the wall. She looked at him. She had, in the intensity of the last hour, almost forgotten he was there, and the sudden reminder of him, standing against the wall with his jacket still folded over his arm, his face the color of a man who has had a very long day that was supposed to contain only a divorce, caught her somewhere in the chest again. Yes, she said, it is. Is there anything you need me to do? She considered him. Can you read a legal instrument from 1987 and tell me if there are structural vulnerabilities in the disbursement language? He blinked. That's what you need right now? A document review? That's what I need right now. He pushed off the wall. Give me the document. Marcus printed it. They worked through the night. The yacht moved. Dante had ordered it out of Miami Harbor once the Coast Guard cleared them, into open water where the defensive options were more favorable and the surveillance variables were reduced. Alara didn't sleep. She didn't expect to sleep. She drank coffee that was too strong and worked through the legal architecture of a document written in 1987 with a man who had signed his divorce papers 14 hours ago. And something about the specific absurdity of that, the compressed extremity of one day, going from a marble conference table to the hull of a yacht in the Atlantic, occasionally surfaced in her awareness and was set aside again. Colton was good at the document review. She had expected him to be. He was genuinely excellent at law underneath everything else. That part had never been performance. He flagged 3 clauses she had already identified and one she hadn't, a jurisdictional reference in the disbursement instrument's 7th paragraph that created a potential ambiguity about which legal system governed the interpretation of personal estate assets, as opposed to organizational holdings. This could be read either way, he said, pointing to the clause. A good opposing counsel makes the argument that the estate disbursement incorporated certain syndicate-adjacent assets as personal property. Yes. Can you close it? I can make the counterargument stronger than theirs. She looked at the paragraph. I need the original Maltese notarization on the compact cross-referenced with the estate instrument's filing date. If the compact was notarized after the disbursement instrument was filed, the disbursement takes precedence by registration date. Colton looked at her for a moment. You practiced law. No. You could have. She said nothing. Elara. He said her name carefully, the way you say a name when you're not sure of your right to it anymore. I know this isn't the moment, and I know you have approximately 40 things that are more important than anything I could say right now, but... He stopped, tried again. Who are you? She looked at him across the table covered in documents, in the early dark of open ocean, and she thought about how to answer that honestly. I'm the same person I was this morning, she said. You just didn't know what you were looking at. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it the way he'd been absorbing things all day. Quietly, without performance, filing it somewhere she couldn't see. The cat, he said. What? Smoke. I'll take care of him when this is done. Until you can get him. He looked back at the document. He chose you anyway. I'll keep him safe until you can have him back. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the document. Thank you, she said. Dawn broke over the Atlantic and the summit began. 8 principals on the yacht's main deck, configured as a formal meeting room in the way that the yacht could be configured for anything given enough time, and Marcus's organizational compulsion. 4 more on screens, time delayed, audio occasionally fragmentary. Dante at the head of the table. Elara beside him, not at his right hand in the traditional hierarchy position, but at the table itself, which was a statement that required no elaboration. Lucien was not present. Lucien was in a secured cabin with 2 guards and a dinner tray, which Elara had specified should be warm and should include the coffee he preferred, because she was not interested in cruelty for its own sake, and because a man who had not eaten was a man whose thinking was impaired, and she needed his thinking intact for later. She presented the legal analysis in 45 minutes, clean, structured, without oratory. The 1987 disbursement instrument, the Maltese Compact, the registration date precedents, the jurisdictional question and its counterargument, the strategic options and their projected timelines and costs. She presented it the way she presented everything, without asking anyone to like it, without cushioning the parts that were uncomfortable, without the performance of authority that people who are uncertain of their authority tend to employ. The room was quiet when she finished. One of the senior principals, a man named Ferris, who ran the organization's European financial operations, and who had been in the room for 23 years and had the demeanor of someone who had survived by being very slow to commit to anything, looked at her across the table. The compact families aren't going to accept a legal argument, Ferris said. They've been waiting 30 years. You're offering them a technicality. I'm offering them a structure, she said. The legal argument is the public layer. The private conversation is different. What's the private conversation? That the Valerius organization is prepared to acknowledge, in a binding private instrument, that the original compact represented a legitimate arrangement, that its violation was a wrong committed by a specific individual who is dead, and that in recognition of that history, we are prepared to offer a voluntary settlement, not as legal obligation, since the legal obligation runs against a dissolved estate, but as acknowledgement of principle. Ferris looked at her. What does that settlement look like? A revenue share on 3 specific legitimate enterprises for 15 years, structured as a consulting arrangement, clean, auditable, defensible if it ever surfaces. She kept her voice level. It's not 49% of everything. It's not what they would have gotten if the compact had been honored. It is something which is more than the legal argument owes them. You're rewarding people who attacked this organization last night. I'm ending a 30-year war before it takes another generation, she said. The people who attacked us last night were acting under instructions from principals who are tired and who have been waiting for something that was never going to come through violence. I'm offering them a door that isn't violence. She looked around the table. The question is whether this organization has the discipline to walk through it. The room was quiet again. Dante looked at her from the head of the table. He had not spoken during her presentation. He was looking at her with something she recognized, not just pride, which was too simple, but the specific expression of someone watching another person be exactly who they are and understanding, perhaps for the first time fully, what that is. He said, "All in favor." 11 votes. 1 abstention. Ferris, who abstained as a matter of professional habit whenever he was uncertain, which Alara noted as the most useful kind of uncertainty. She had her mandate. She went to Lucian's cabin herself. He looked up when she came in. He'd eaten, she noted. The tray was mostly clear, which was good. He looked less like a man conducting a strategy and more like a man who had been awake for 30 hours and was feeling it in his joints. "The summit voted," she said. "I assumed it would." "I need you to make a call." She sat across from him. "To the Compact family's primary contact, tonight, before they regroup and decide to try a different approach." He looked at her carefully. "You're asking me to be your intermediary. You're already their intermediary. I'm asking you to be ours as well." She held his gaze. "I'm not offering you absolution. What you did to Dante, what you took from him, that's his to reckon with, not mine. But I need the channel you've spent 20 years building, and I need it in the next 6 hours." "What do you need me to say?" "That there is a proposal. That the Valerius heir requests a meeting, neutral location, small delegations, within 72 hours. She paused. "And that the proposal involves something they have not been offered before, which is an acknowledgement." Lucian was quiet for a moment. He looked at his hands. "They'll want to know if it's genuine." "Tell them to look at who's making the offer," she said, "and tell them she's not her grandfather." He looked up. She stood. "Make the call, Lucien." She was at the door when he said her name. Not her cover name, her real one. The one she'd been born with and spent 11 years not using. She stopped. "The document case," he said. "The secretary's deposition. There's a final section I didn't show you tonight. He stopped. The word that followed had the specific quality of words that cost something. "I should have." She turned. "Your grandfather's agreement," he said. "The original compact. There were 4 signatories." He paused. "One of them was not a syndicate family." She waited. "One of them was a private individual. Someone who provided the initial capital that allowed Emilio Valerius to build the first structure. Someone who was owed, by the compact's terms, not a percentage of assets, but something else." He looked at her with the tired, stripped-down expression of a man who has been managing information for so long that the relief of releasing it is almost physical. "The 4th signatory was your grandmother, your actual grandmother, your grandfather's wife." The room did not move. The yacht moved. She could feel it under her feet, the Atlantic swell, the slight pitch and roll, but the room felt very still. "She didn't die in the massacre," Ilara said. "No." "And the secretary who documented everything has been keeping her location," Lucian said quietly, "at her own request, for 18 years. Ilara stood in the doorway of a secured cabin on a yacht somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean, and she felt the ground shift in the specific way it shifts when you discover that the story of your life contains a chapter you did not know existed, that someone you had accepted as gone is not gone, that the shape of what you are fighting for is larger and stranger and more personal than it was 30 seconds ago. She said, "Where?" Lucian told her. She walked out of the cabin and down the corridor, and she was already moving toward Dante's location before she had fully processed what her legs were doing. Because some things the body decides before the mind catches up. Some things bypass reasoning entirely and go straight to the place where the oldest, most fundamental things live. The things that were there before you learned to be careful, before you learned to be small, before you learned to disappear. She found Dante on the upper deck, alone, leaning on the rail and looking at water that was going from black to deep blue in the early morning light. She stood beside him. She said, "I need to tell you something." He looked at her. He read her face the way he'd been reading her face since she was a child. That specific older brother literacy, the one that had kept her alive when nothing else did. "How bad?" he said. "Not bad," she said, and found to her own faint surprise that this was true. "Not bad at all," she told him. The sun came up over the Atlantic while she talked, the particular slow Atlantic sunrise that builds from the horizon in layers. Gray first, then the faintest pink, then the kind of gold that doesn't announce itself but simply arrives and fills everything. And Dante Valerius, who had not cried in front of his sister since the night of the massacre, stood at the rail of his yacht with his hands gripping the metal and his eyes very bright, and did not speak for a long time after she finished. Then he said, "We go get her." "After Vienna," Elara said. "After the compact meeting, after the organization is stable." She put her hand over his on the rail. "She's been safe for 18 years. She'll be safe for another 3 weeks. He looked at the water. "Together," he said. "Together," she said. Below them the yacht drove through the morning sea, and in a secured cabin a man was making a phone call that would either open a door or close one. And somewhere in Colton Mercer's apartment, a gray cat named Smoke was probably sitting on the wrong side of a door waiting for someone who hadn't come home. And somewhere in a location that Elara now knew and was holding in her chest like something fragile and extraordinary, a woman who was supposed to be gone was still, against all the architecture of grief and history and organized violence, alive. The fortress outside Valletta had not been used for anything official in 40 years. It sat on a limestone ridge above the Mediterranean with the particular indifference of old military architecture. Walls 4 feet thick, sight lines in every direction. A position chosen by people who understood defense at a fundamental level and had built accordingly. The syndicate had acquired it through 3 ownership layers in the 1990s and used it since as a command facility, which meant its operational infrastructure was modern and its exterior was left deliberately unrestored because buildings that looked like ruins attracted less attention than buildings that looked important. They arrived at night. 3 vehicles, a helicopter that set down on the plateau north of the main structure, a second vehicle already positioned at the southern approach that Elara had arranged 48 hours earlier through a channel that did not run through Lucien and did not run through anyone Lucien knew. The compact family's delegation was already inside. She had gotten here first. That was the point. The main chamber of the fortress was lit by functional overhead lighting that did nothing for the aesthetics of 800-year-old stone, but did allow everyone present to see everyone else's face clearly, which Elara had specified because she wanted faces visible and she wanted her own face visible, and she wanted the people across the table to understand from the first moment that they were not dealing with Emilio Valerius's ghost or Dante Valerius's reputation or anyone's intermediary. They were dealing with her. The compact family's delegation was 4 people. She had expected 4. She had researched each of them for 72 hours and knew their backgrounds, their priorities, their individual pressure points, and the specific argument each of them would find most difficult to reject. The lead negotiator was a woman in her 50s named Carla Mendez Voss, which gave Elara a moment's pause until she processed that the surname was coincidence, or perhaps not coincidence, perhaps one of those historical echoes that accumulate in the lives of families that have been circling each other for 2 generations. Carla looked at Elara across the fortress table with the expression of a woman who has been fighting something for a very long time and is not yet willing to let herself believe it might be ending. Dante sat to Elara's right, Marcus at the far end, 2 advisors between them. Lucien was not present. Lucien was in Gibraltar, under the supervision of 2 of Marcus's people, pending decisions that were not yet made. "You requested this meeting," Carla said. Her English was precise, lightly accented. "Through an unusual channel." "Through an honest one," Elara said, "which I understand is different from what you've been dealing with." A pause. "You're referring to Arcos." "I'm referring to 20 years of misdirection that served neither of us." Elara set the proposal document on the table and slid it across. "This is what we're offering. I'd like you to read it before I explain it." Carla looked at the document. She looked at Elara. She picked it up. The room was very quiet while she read. One of her advisors leaned over to read alongside her. The stone walls held the silence the way stone walls hold temperature. Completely, indifferently, without opinion. Carla reached the 3rd page and stopped. She looked up. "This acknowledgement," she said, "this language here, The organization recognizes the original compact as representing a legitimate arrangement between parties of equal standing and recognizes that the violation of that compact caused harm that was not subsequently addressed. She put the document down. You wrote this? I did. Not a lawyer. I'm familiar with the relevant history, Ilara said, and I think the language is accurate. Carla was quiet for a moment. She looked at the document again. She looked at Dante, studying him, Ilara thought, looking for Emilio in him, looking for the thing she'd been fighting, and whatever she found there, or didn't find, made something in her face change. The revenue arrangement, Carla said, 15 years. 15 years structured as specified, renewable by mutual agreement at year 12. The enterprises listed are all legitimate. Entirely. Auditable by any third party you designate. Another pause. And in exchange. In exchange, Ilara said, this ends. The claim is settled. The history is acknowledged, not erased, acknowledged. And neither organization spends the next 30 years finishing something that should have been resolved before either of us was old enough to understand what it was. Carla looked at her for a long time. You're not what I expected, she said. I know, Ilara said. Neither is this. The negotiation took 4 hours. It was not smooth. There were 3 points at which it came close to collapsing, one of which involved Dante gripping the edge of the table hard enough that she could see the strain in his forearms, one of which involved Carla's lead advisor walking out of the room for 11 minutes and returning without explanation. It was not smooth because nothing real is smooth, and Ilara had learned a long time ago that the smoothness of a negotiation is inversely proportional to its durability. At the end of 4 hours, Carla Mendez Vos signed the settlement instrument. Dante signed it. Ilara signed it as the authorized heir of the Valerius estate, which was the capacity the compact's terms required. And as she pressed the pen to the paper, she felt the specific and unrepeatable sensation of something enormous, finally, after 30 years, becoming something that did not move anymore. She set the pen down. She looked at Carla. Carla looked at her. Your grandfather, Carla said, was a difficult man. Yes, Ilara said. He was. You are not. Ilara said nothing. She wasn't sure that was entirely true, and she was not in the habit of accepting assessments of herself that she hadn't verified. The delegation left. The chamber emptied gradually. Advisors, security, Marcus moving through the room with his tablet, cataloging and documenting with the thoroughness that was his primary emotional language. Dante walked to the far window and stood looking out at the Mediterranean, which at this hour was a flat pewter plate stretching to the horizon. Ilara sat alone at the long table. She sat with the signed document in front of her and the stone walls around her and the specific quality of silence that descends after something large has concluded, and she allowed herself for approximately 90 seconds to feel the full weight of the day and the days before it and the 11 years before those days. Then she stood. She had 2 more things to do. The first was Lucy. He was brought to the chamber after the compact delegation had cleared the building. He came in without the guards having to guide him, walked in on his own, sat down across from her on his own, put his hands on the table in the same position he'd used in the yacht's hidden compartment, and waited. The settlement is signed, she said. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Good. The evidence you compiled, the secretary's documentation, the communication intercepts, the 20 years of internal intelligence you gathered, all of it goes to an international accountability body, not law enforcement directly, an intermediary body that handles organizational crime documentation. The process is slow and it is not designed to destroy, but it creates a public record. She looked at him. It includes your role. He opened his eyes. Yes. You cooperate fully with that process. Yes. And then you're done, she said. Not imprisoned, I'm not going to do to you what you were willing to do to this family. You retire. You disappear. You become someone who is no longer involved in anything that concerns us. She paused. If you can manage that. He looked at her. You're letting me walk away. I'm letting you live a quiet life, she said. There's a difference. Dante will tell you what the difference is if you need it explained. Lucian was quiet for a moment. She watched him process it. The decision, its implications, The complicated internal arithmetic of a man who has spent his life calculating and is now on the receiving end of a calculation he didn't write. "The fourth signatory," he said. "Your grandmother. You've spoken to Dante." "Yes." "Is he... He's going to be all right," she said. "Eventually." A pause. "I should have told him years ago." "Yes," she said. "You should have." She stood. She looked at him one final time. This man who had shaped 20 years of her family's story from the inside, who had been trusted and had used the trust and had somewhere in the complicated moral accounting of it, convinced himself that he was doing something that could be justified. She looked at him and felt nothing that was clean enough to name. "Go home, Lucien," she said, "whatever that means to you." She walked out. The second thing was the call. She made it from the fortress's outer battlement, leaning against the old stone with the Mediterranean spread below her in the gray gold of early evening, the salt air clean and cold against her face. The number connected on the third ring. The voice that answered was old, not frail. There's a difference, and she heard it immediately, heard the specific quality of a voice that is aged into something stripped of anything unnecessary, something that is only what it is, nothing performed, nothing constructed. She said, "It's Alara." Silence on the line. A long silence. The kind that has things moving through it. Then the voice said her name. Her real name. The one she'd been given before any of this. And Alara Voss stood on the battlement of a centuries-old fortress above the Mediterranean and felt the specific and almost unbearable sensation of a circle closing. Not neatly, not without cost, not in the way that stories close when they're trying to reassure you, but closing the way real things close, with all the roughness and the grief and the strange, persistent insistence of people who should have been defeated and weren't. "I'm coming," she said. 3 days. Maybe 4. The voice said, "That I'll be here." "I know," Alara said. She lowered the phone. Below her, the Mediterranean moved in its ancient, indifferent way, and the sun was going down in layers of color that nobody had named adequately yet. And somewhere behind her in the fortress, Dante was looking at the same sky from a different window and thinking about the same woman. And 3,000 miles away in a Miami apartment, a gray cat named Smoke was sitting by a window waiting for someone who was, for the first time in 11 years, actually on her way home. The village was small enough that strangers were noticed, but not so small that strangers were unusual. It sat on the Ligurian coast north of Genoa, the kind of place that exists in the particular fold between tourist maps and actual life. Houses the color of dried apricots and old terracotta stacked on a hillside that dropped straight into water so blue it looked manufactured. The main road was barely a road. The harbor held 8 fishing boats and one very old motorized dinghy that belonged to a man who had not, as far as anyone in the village knew, taken it out in 3 years. Alara arrived on a Tuesday morning in a rented car she'd picked up in Genoa, alone, having left Dante at the airport with the specific argument that this was something she needed to do without him first. He had disagreed. He had disagreed at length with the particular eloquence of a man who has recently discovered that a person he loves is alive and has strong opinions about the pace at which he gets to see her. She had listened to all of it and then gotten in the car anyway, and his last expression, frustrated, frightened, trying not to show that he was frightened, had stayed with her for the 2-hour drive north. She found the house by the address Lucian had given her, cross-referenced against the property records Marcus had pulled, which matched a purchase made 18 years ago by a Maltese holding company that had since dissolved. The property transferred quietly to a private individual whose name on the local registry was not the name Alara was looking for, but which she had understood, the moment she saw it, was a name chosen for the specific quality of its ordinariness. The house was set slightly back from the main cluster of the village, accessed by a path that ran between 2 low stone walls. A garden on the south side, real vegetables, not decorative, tomatoes and something dark-leafed that might have been charred, staked and tended with the focused pragmatism of someone who grew things to eat them. A clay pot by the door with herbs in it, rosemary. She noted the rosemary. She knocked. The woman who opened the door was 81 years old, which Alara had known from the documentation and which did not prevent the number from being, in person, somehow irrelevant. She was small, smaller than Alara had expected, though she wasn't sure what she had expected, some calcified image from a photograph in Lucian's files. And she was thin in the way of people who have always been thin rather than people who have become thin through difficulty. Her hair was white and cut short. Her eyes were the particular gray-green that Alara had seen in mirrors her entire life, and had never been able to attribute to either parent. She was looking at Alara with an expression that was not surprise. She had known someone was coming, Lucien, or the call, or both. She had known, and she had been waiting, and the waiting had arranged itself on her face as something that was not quite patience and not quite fear, but lived in the territory between them. "Come in," she said. Her Italian was local, layered over something older. Her English, when she switched to it, when Alara said her name and the woman said, "I know who you are, I've known for some time," was the English of someone who had learned it late and thoroughly and had been using it for decades. Her name was Miriam Sola. The name she'd been born with was different. The name she'd had when she married Emilio Valerius at the age of 22 was different still. And it was that name, the married name, the dynasty name, that Alara had grown up hearing used only in past tense, only in the context of loss, only in the architecture of a story that had been given to her already finished. The interior of the house was what the exterior had suggested, functional, clean, undecorated in the way of spaces where the person living in them has deliberately chosen not to accumulate. A table. 4 chairs, though clearly only one was used regularly. Bookshelves that were genuinely used, spines cracked, some of them, papers tucked between volumes. A window that looked out toward the harbor. Miriam made coffee. She made it in a small stovetop pot, and she did it with the particular efficiency of someone who has made coffee in the same pot, in the same way for a long time. And Alara sat at the table and watched her and thought about what it cost to disappear, and then, at 81 years old, to still be here. To have stayed here. To have spent 18 years in a Ligurian village, letting the world believe you were ash. She put the coffee on the table and sat across from Alara and looked at her with those gray-green eyes that Alara had apparently inherited from a woman she'd been told was dead. "You're angry," Miriam said. Alara stopped. She considered the question honestly, the way she tried to consider most things. "I don't know yet what I am." "That's fair." Miriam wrapped both hands around her cup. Her hands were the oldest thing about her, veined, spotted, the particular texture of hands that have worked. "I can explain it, if that would help. I can explain all of it. Or you can ask what you came to ask, and I'll answer that." "Why?" Alara said. "That's what I came to ask. Why you let us think—" "Because Dante was 17, Miriam said. It came out flat, without apology, the way old people sometimes say things. Not unkindly, but without the cushioning that younger people apply because they haven't yet accepted that cushioning is mostly for the person doing the cushioning. He was 17 years old, and he had just lost everything he had known, and he was holding a 13-year-old child who was barely functional, and he needed something to move toward. Not something to protect. Not someone else to be responsible for." She looked at Alara. "He needed a mission. He needed a direction. If he'd known I survived, he would have spent the next 5 years trying to reach me, and in reaching me, he would have exposed me, and the people who believed the massacre was complete would have corrected their error." "Lucien knew," Alara said. "Lucien found me 8 months after. I had gone to him because—" She stopped. Something shifted in her face. "Because I had trusted him. Because he was the person in the organization I had trusted most, after Emilio. And trusting Emilio had become complicated." Her hands moved around the cup. "I told Lucien I had survived. I asked him to keep it from the organization and to keep it from Dante, temporarily, until I understood what had happened and who had been responsible. And he kept it from Dante for 18 years. He kept it because I asked him to," she said. "And then yes, because it served other purposes as well. I was aware of that. I'm not going to tell you I was naive about what Lucien was doing with the information he had." She looked at the window. "I made choices that I cannot make clean by explaining them. I know that." Alara sat with that. She sat with it and drank her coffee, which was strong and slightly bitter and very good. And she looked at this woman who was the shape of a mystery she had carried without knowing she was carrying it. And she thought about the architecture of families, how they transmit not just blood and bone, but the specific patterns of their damage. How the thing Miriam had done in the name of protection was not entirely different from the thing Alara herself had done for 11 years, disappearing into a careful small life to protect herself and, she had always told herself, the people around her. I spent 11 years hiding, Alara said. I know. I thought I was keeping people safe. I know that too. Miriam looked at her. Were you? Alara thought about it honestly. Some of the time, she said. Partly. And partly I was keeping myself safe from something I didn't know how to be anymore. Miriam nodded. Not agreement exactly. Recognition. The specific nod of someone who has had this thought about themselves and has been living with the conclusion for long enough that hearing it said by someone else registers as confirmation rather than revelation. Your grandfather, Alara said. The compact. The violation. Emilio was not a good man, Miriam said. I want to say that clearly because I spent 30 years in proximity to him, and I have had 18 years to assess it without the proximity distorting things, and that's what I've concluded. He was capable, he was driven. He cared about the family in the way that certain men care about their families, as extensions of themselves, as evidence of their own significance. But he was not good. She paused. The compact was real. The violation was real. What he did to the other families was a betrayal of an agreement he had signed and benefited from, and then decided was inconvenient. She looked down at her hands. I documented it because I believed at the time that documentation would eventually be used to correct it, that there would be a moment when accountability would be possible. There's a moment now, Alara said. The settlement is signed. Miriam looked up. The compact families have a 15-year revenue arrangement with the organization. The violation is acknowledged in a private instrument. The public accountability process starts next month. Lucien's documentation goes to an international body. Alara looked at her. It's not everything they were owed. It's what was possible without destroying what Dante has built. Miriam was quiet for a long time. Outside through the window, a fishing boat was making its way out of the harbor, moving slowly against the morning swell, its engine audible from this distance as a low, distant pulse. The secretary, Miriam said. Agnes. She's well? Still in Gibraltar. She's 93 and apparently has opinions about everything, according to Lucien's people. Alara paused. We're going to bring her here if she wants to come, or wherever she wants to go. She's earned the right to choose. Miriam's face did something complicated. She stayed, she said, almost to herself. All this time. She stayed, Alara confirmed. Miriam put her coffee cup down. She pressed her hands flat on the table, a gesture that Alara recognized with a start. The same gesture Dante used, the same gesture she had apparently inherited without knowing from whom. And she looked at Alara with the gray-green eyes that were undeniably and irreversibly the same eyes. Your brother, she said. He's outside the village, Alara said. Waiting. I told him to give me 2 hours. 2 hours. Something in Miriam's face that was almost amusement. He listened? No, he's probably been parked at the edge of the village for 45 minutes. She paused. He is not someone who finds waiting tolerable when the people he loves are involved. No, Miriam said. He wasn't, even at 17. A pause. He used to stand outside my door when I was ill. He never knocked. He just stood there, as if proximity was a form of protection. Alara thought of every time she'd been aware of Dante positioned between her and a door. Every meeting where he'd angled himself slightly in front of her. Every room they'd entered together where he'd cataloged the exits before he cataloged anything else. He still does that, she said. Miriam stood. She moved to the window and stood looking out at the harbor, her back to Alara, and the morning light came in at an angle across her, and she was, in that light, very old and very present, and very much a person who had survived a great many things through no mechanism more mystical than stubbornness and the specific refusal to stop. Tell him to come, she said. Alara took out her phone. She sent a single word. 12 minutes later, she had expected 10, but the road was narrow, and Dante had apparently parked further away than she'd given him credit for. She heard footsteps on the stone path outside. Then nothing. Then a knock at the door that was very controlled, which meant the person knocking was working hard to make it controlled. Miriam turned from the window. She looked at the door. She said very quietly, "Open it." Alara opened it. Dante stood in the doorway with the Mediterranean light behind him, and his face doing the thing she had watched it do at the rail of the yacht. That stripped, unguarded thing, the thing beneath all the authority, and the capability and the 45 years of learning to be unreadable, and he looked past Elara at the small white-haired woman standing by the window, and he stopped. He stopped completely. Not a hesitation, a stop. A full-body arrest of motion, as though the signal from his brain to his legs had been rerouted. Miriam looked at him. She said, "You got old." And Dante Valerius, who had not cried in front of his sister since the night of the massacre, and who had, in the intervening 28 years, constructed an entire identity around being the person who did not require comfort and did not display need. That man crossed the small room in 3 steps and put his arms around an 81-year-old woman who was a foot shorter than him and stood there, and the sound he made was not a word and did not need to be. Elara stepped outside and closed the door. She stood on the stone path between the low walls with the rosemary smell from the pot by the door and the sound of the harbor below and the sun warm on the back of her neck, and she stayed there for a long time, not thinking, particularly, not planning, just standing in a place, in a morning, in a specific longitude and latitude of her own life that she had not known existed 48 hours ago, and which now felt, with the particular irrational force of things that are true, like something she had been walking toward for a very long time. After a while, her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Colton. She answered. "The cat," he said, "has eaten an entire palm-sized piece of prosciutto that I left on the counter for approximately 45 seconds. She felt something in her chest that was very close to laughter. "He does that. I'm aware he does that. I've now been made aware at some expense." A pause. His voice shifted. "Not much, just enough." "Are you okay?" She looked at the door of the house. Through the small window beside it, she could see the shapes of 2 people sitting at the table now. Dante had pulled a chair close to Miriam's, their heads inclined toward each other in the specific posture of people covering distance. "Yes," she said, and found it was the most uncomplicated true thing she'd said in recent memory. "The firm called," Colton said. "Randall wants a meeting. He's seen the news about the Miami Harbor incident, the maritime investigation, the press about the Valerius organization." A pause. "He's asking questions I don't know how to answer." "You don't have to answer them." "I'm aware, I'm just—" He stopped. "I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to do now. In a general sense." She sat down on the low stone wall. The harbor was visible from here, the blue water, the 8 fishing boats, the old dinghy. "What do you want to do?" A longer pause. "That's not a question I've spent a lot of time with," he said. "I know." "You knew that about me," he said. "When we were married. You knew that." "Yes." "Why didn't you—" He stopped himself. She heard him do it. The beginning of the accusation, the hand pulling it back. "Never mind. That's not a useful question right now." "It's a fair question," she said. "I didn't say anything because I was busy not saying a lot of things. I was so focused on what I couldn't tell you that I stopped telling you anything." She paused. "That wasn't fair to you." I'm not calling to relitigate the marriage, Elara. I'm calling because I have a cat who has just eaten prosciutto, and I wanted to know if you were alive." Another pause, shorter. "Which you are." "Good." "Good," she agreed. "The drive," he said. "The forensic accountant. He's been asking me questions about whether he needs to talk to anyone official. Tell him Marcus Vale will contact him within the week. He doesn't need to do anything before that. He's not in any danger." She paused. "He really won't need to do anything that compromises his practice. He'll be relieved." A beat. "Elara." "Yes." "I'm sorry." He said it simply, without architecture, without the prefatory legal structuring of apology that she'd seen him apply in professional contexts. "For the marriage. For the way for a lot of things. I'm not asking you to do anything with that. I just wanted to say it while I was reasonably sure you were in a location where nobody was shooting at anything." She looked at the water. "I'm sorry too," she said, "for the things I kept. I had reasons. They were real reasons. They were also not the whole story." "No." "I'm coming back to Miami," she said. "Not immediately. There are things to do here first, but in a few weeks." "Okay." "I'd like to get smoke." "He'll be ready," Colton said. "He's been sitting on your side of on the guest bed, in the room you were in." A pause. "He knows something changed." She said nothing for a moment. Colton, she said it carefully. I'm not. She stopped. I don't know what I am, or what any of this is going forward. I want to be honest about that. I know, he said. I'm not asking you for anything. He stopped. She heard him exhale. I just wanted you to know that I see you now. I know it's late. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I wanted you to know. She sat on the stone wall in the Ligurian sun with the harbor below her and the rosemary smell and the sound of two people inside a small house beginning the long, slow work of recovering something that had been thought lost. And she held the phone against her ear and felt the specific weight of being seen by someone who had been looking in the wrong direction for a very long time and had finally, too late and honestly, looked correctly. I know, she said. Thank you. She ended the call. She sat for a while longer. Then she went back inside. The weeks that followed were not cinematic. She wanted to be clear with herself about that because there is a tendency, after the worst is over, after the documents are signed and the threats are neutralized and the long lost are found, to recast the aftermath as a kind of glow, a warmth, a resolution that feels as clean as an ending. It was not that. What it was, complicated, slow, occasionally tedious, occasionally unbearable, and necessary. The accountability process that Marcus had set in motion took 3 months to complete its first phase. It was not satisfying in the way justice is supposed to be satisfying. It was bureaucratic, it moved at the pace of institutions, it produced reports that were thorough and dry and would eventually result in consequences that were meaningful without being dramatic. That was how it worked in reality, and Alara had decided sometime in those weeks that she was going to stop waiting for reality to behave like something more. The criminal network that had represented the organization's darker operations was dismantled in stages, not all at once. That was the honest version, not the clean version. Some pieces of it dissolved willingly, redirected into the legitimate infrastructure that Alara began building with a small team of people she chose herself, for qualifications rather than loyalty. Some pieces required harder pressure. Some pieces were simply cut loose and allowed to fall, which was the most efficient option and also the one that kept Dante awake at night, which Alara understood, and which she held space for without telling him it was the right decision because she wasn't certain it was. Miriam moved from the Ligurian village to a house outside Florence that she chose herself, which she furnished with the same pragmatic spareness of the village house, minus the 4 chairs. She bought 6 chairs. She said, when Alara asked her about this, "People come now." Agnes arrived from Gibraltar in a wheelchair she refused to treat as a limitation and with opinions about modern architecture that she was prepared to share with anyone who remained stationary long enough. She and Miriam had not seen each other in 18 years. Their reunion lasted 4 days, during which Dante stood outside the house both days with no apparent awareness that he was doing it. Lucia and Arcos moved to a small town in the Portuguese interior, and as far as Marcus's periodic checks confirmed, planted a garden and did nothing else. Whether this constituted punishment was a question Alara occasionally turned over and set back down. It was the decision she had made. She had made it for reasons that were partly merciful and partly practical and partly something she couldn't name clearly, which was that she had seen enough of what vengeance built and was not interested in building more of it. Vanessa Hale resurfaced in Sao Paulo, where she was picked up by Brazilian federal authorities cooperating with the International Accountability Body's preliminary findings. She was extradited. She was tried. She was convicted on 2 counts related to the financial fraud that had been engineered against Alara's marriage and 3 counts related to her organizational affiliations. Her sentencing hearing was a matter of public record, and Alara did not attend it and did not ask for updates about it, which was a decision she found, to her mild surprise, was easy to maintain. Colton closed his partnership with Randall Patel and opened a smaller practice with 2 associates focused on international estate law, which was a less prestigious path than the one he'd been on, and which he appeared, from the limited information Alara gathered, to find more interesting. He donated a significant amount of money to a legal aid organization, which was not the kind of thing he'd done before, and which she noticed without commenting on. Smoke came home in early December. Alara had returned to Miami 3 weeks earlier, to an apartment she had rented in a different part of the city, not Brickell, somewhere quieter, closer to the water, in a different way. She had furnished it slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who had learned that the details of a space matter, that the difference between a place you inhabit and a place you live in is largely the attention you pay it. Colton brought the cat in a carrier at 11 in the morning on a Tuesday. He handed her the carrier at the door. Smoke, inside, said something loud and immediate and aggrieved about the indignity of the transportation. "He complained the whole way," Colton said. "He does that," she said. She looked at Colton. He looked at her. He was thinner than he'd been in Miami Harbor. The past 3 months had done something to him. She could see it. The particular thinning that happens when someone has spent time thinking hard about things they'd previously avoided thinking about. He looked less polished. He looked more like a person. "I have the transfer documents for his vet records," he said. He held out an envelope. "He's due for a dental cleaning in February. The vet says it's not urgent, but worth doing." She took the envelope. "Thank you for keeping him. I got used to him." He paused. "I'm going to miss him, if I'm being honest." She looked at Colton standing in her doorway with the particular expression of a man who has said the true thing and is waiting to find out what it costs. And she thought about everything that was true simultaneously, that she had loved him, that he had failed her in ways that were real and specific, that she had kept herself from him in ways that made his failure partly possible, that neither of those facts canceled the other, that they were both carrying the weight of 7 years in ways that would not fully resolve, and that this was what happened when two people did their best, and their best was not sufficient, and they were both honest enough to know it. "You can visit," she said. "If you want, he'd probably like it." Something in Colton's face, careful, held, the expression of a man who knows the difference between a door and an open door. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." He left. She brought the carrier inside and opened it, and Smoke came out with the affronted dignity of a cat who has been inconvenienced and is not going to let it go immediately. He walked around the perimeter of the apartment, inspecting it with his tail elevated, assessing whether it met his standards. He smelled the couch. He jumped up onto it and turned around 3 times and sat down. He looked at her. She sat down beside him. He put his head against her leg. She put her hand on his back and felt him breathe, the small, reliable weight of him, and she sat in her apartment in the December Miami light, the winter light that was still warm here, still gold, still particular to this specific latitude, and she breathed along with him for a while. The company she was building had a name she had chosen for its accuracy rather than its elegance: Voss International Strategic Council. It was not a front. It was not a legacy operation with legitimate surfaces. It was, as specifically as she could make it, what it said it was: an advisory firm that handled complex international organizational transitions, the kind of work that existed at the edges of multiple jurisdictions and required someone who understood that the map of power in the world is not the map that appears in official documents. She was not naive about what she was doing. She was not pretending that the organization she had grown from had clean hands, or that her own were spotless, or that the settlement she had negotiated represented justice in any complete sense. She had spent enough of her life inside complicated things to know that purity is a story people tell themselves when they want permission to stop trying. She was not stopping. She was starting differently. The first client was Carla Mendez Voss's organization. This was either an irony or a beginning, and she had decided it was a beginning. She worked, she built. She traveled, to Florence to see Miriam, to the Portuguese interior to sit with Lucien once in a way that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, but something more honest than either, to Gibraltar where Agnès pressed her hands and told her, in a mixture of Maltese and Italian and fragments of English, that she had her great-grandmother's eyes, and also her great-grandmother's stubbornness, which Agnès appeared to consider both a warning and a compliment. She went to Dante in February, when the worst of the organizational restructuring was complete enough that he could breathe without counting the cost of breathing. They had dinner in the house he kept in Tuscany, just the two of them, and they talked the way they had talked when she was 13 and he was 17, and the world had just collapsed, and all they had was the other person's voice in the dark. They talked about their grandfather, about what it means to inherit something that was built wrong, about the difference between dismantling and destroying, which was a distinction Dante was still working out in his body rather than his head, about Miriam, who called Dante every Sunday, and who had, over the months, become a person he was tentatively learning to have in his life without either of them trying to recover something that was gone. She's not going to be what I remember, Dante said. No, Ilara said. She's better in some ways. Harder. She knows more. A pause. That's what happens when people survive things. He looked at her across the dinner table. Are you okay? She considered it the way she considered most things, honestly, without the reflex toward reassurance. I'm becoming okay, she said. That's not the same thing, but it's real. He nodded. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers briefly, the way he'd done when she was a child, and the way she had almost forgotten felt like anything at all. Good, he said. In March, she was in the Miami office she had set up in a building that was not in Brickell, was not glass and chrome, was in an older part of the city where the light came in at angles through uneven windows, and the walls had been painted recently over older paint, and you could see the layers if you looked. She was reading a contract when Marcus called. He called to tell her that the International Accountability Body had issued its preliminary findings, that several governments were opening formal investigations, that the consequences she had set in motion were now moving under their own institutional weight toward outcomes she could not fully control and had never expected to fully control. Is it what you wanted? He asked. It's what I started, she said. Whether it's what I wanted depends on what it turns into. You're comfortable with that uncertainty? She looked out her uneven window at the Miami street below. The particular Miami mid-morning, the light doing its aggressive, flattering thing to every surface. The ordinary traffic of a city that had captured her humiliation on camera 5 months ago and which was now simply, indifferently, continuing. I'm working on it, she said. The yacht was in the harbor when she walked down to the waterfront that evening. Not an accident. Dante was in Miami for meetings, and he had berthed it in the same harbor, and she had not asked him to move it. She walked past the dock where she had stood in October in her charcoal dress and watched an impossible thing happen, and she noted it the way you note a location where something significant occurred, without drama, as a piece of geography that is now part of your personal map. She kept walking. The waterfront was busy in the early evening. Joggers, couples, a group of children who were apparently engaged in a dispute about a bicycle that was audible from some distance. The water was the particular Florida evening color that was not quite blue and not quite gray, and shifted between them depending on the angle. She walked without a destination, which was something she had not done in a very long time, walking without calculating an exit or a perimeter or a distance to cover. She walked until she was tired. She sat on a bench near the south end of the waterfront and watched the water move. A pelican landed on a nearby piling and regarded her with the pelican's characteristic expression of distinguished contempt. She regarded it back. Her phone was quiet. Smoke was at the apartment, probably on the couch, probably in the specific position of a cat, who has decided his living arrangements are acceptable and is not going to say so directly. Dante was somewhere on the yacht, doing whatever Dante did in the evenings, which she had never entirely known and had stopped needing to. Miriam was in Florence, where it was already night, probably reading. She read constantly, had been reading constantly for 18 years, was making her way through, she had told Ilara last Sunday, a novel she described as too long by a quarter but honest about its people, which was, Ilara had thought, both a literary opinion and possibly something else. Colton had texted that morning, a photograph of his new office, which was smaller than his old one and had a better window, with the caption, "Thought you'd appreciate the light." She had looked at it for a moment and written back, "I do," and then had gone back to her contract, and the conversation had been exactly what it was, which was neither more nor less than two people who had been married and had failed each other and were figuring out, slowly and without a map, whether the people they were becoming had room for something they hadn't managed the first time. She did not know the answer to that. She was not going to pretend she did. The pelican decided she was not interesting and departed. The light was going, the way it goes in South Florida in early spring. Not gradually, but in stages, a step-down process, the sky going through amber and rose, and then the specific bruised purple that comes just before the streetlights matter, each stage distinct, each one the last of its kind until tomorrow. She sat in the last of the purple light and breathed the salt air and felt the bench under her and the accumulated weight of everything that had happened in the past 5 months and the years before those months, the whole long complicated evidence of her own life pressing against her with the particular insistence of things that are real. She was not the woman who had stood on this waterfront in October. She was not the woman who had made coffee in a kitchen that wasn't quite hers, while a man she loved in an imperfect way checked his phone and a gray cat circled her ankles. She was not the woman who had signed divorce papers with steady hands and felt something she couldn't name rise up through her chest as she walked toward an elevator. She was not any of the women she had been in the years of careful smallness, the years of deliberate invisibility, the years of keeping so much of herself in reserve that she had sometimes, in the darkest part of the nights in the guest bedroom, been afraid she had forgotten what the rest of her felt like. She remembered now. The streetlights came on, one after another down the waterfront, each one catching the edge of the water below it and making a small private pool of reflection. She watched them come on, each one ordinary, each one doing exactly what it was built to do, lighting a small piece of the dark without drama, without requiring acknowledgement. She stood up, she put her hands in her jacket pockets and turned away from the water and walked back toward the city. And her steps were the steps of a woman who knows where she is going and who has decided, not easily, not without cost, not with the smoothness that stories sometimes pretend is available, to go there. The city opened before her in its lights and its noise and its ongoing, unremarkable life. And she walked into it, and she did not look back, not because the past was behind her in any simple sense, but because the past was in her. In the gray-green eyes she now understood the origin of, in the muscle memory her hands carried, in the shape of every decision she'd made that had led her, through paths she would not have chosen, to this particular waterfront, this particular evening, this particular version of herself. She walked. The story of the gentle wife that Miami had told itself was already becoming something else. She had heard it shifting in the weeks since, heard the way the narrative was beginning to correct itself in the city's collective memory. The woman on the dock replacing the woman in the conference room, the black yacht replacing the marble table. She had no particular interest in that story either, the newer version, the one that tried to make her into an icon. She was not interested in being a version of herself that other people found manageable. She was interested in the work and in the people she was doing it for, and in the 81-year-old woman in Florence who called Dante every Sunday and who had survived, against every reasonable expectation, long enough to sit at a table with the grandchildren she had given up in order to protect them. She was interested in mornings when the coffee was strong and the cat was difficult and the window showed ordinary light. She turned a corner and the waterfront was gone from sight behind her, and the city was all around her, full of people living inside their ordinary troubles. And she was one of them, and also not one of them. And that was, she had finally decided, all right, that was exactly all right.